Welcome everyone to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 19th meeting of 2020. Today we continue taking evidence in the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill. Today we have the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, Rosanna Cunningham, and the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell. Good morning to you both. The Cabinet Secretaries are joined by their officials, that's Emma Lipinska, the Constitutional Policy Manager, and Charles Stewart Roper, Head of Environment Strategy and Governance Unit in the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretaries, and I imagine my first question is probably for Michael Russell. The Government hasn't set out the criteria for deciding which measures that the Scottish Government would or would not choose to align with. I just want to ask why that is, and if the principles are agreed to common frameworks, would they also apply to keeping pace?
Karina, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning, and I think it's a very good, central question. I think the answer lies in two parts. First of which is to point to a mix of things which are involved here as we cope with leaving the EU, something we did not vote for, and which inevitably complicates the legislative and procedural landscape. And therefore, we're not in a simple mix of possibilities. We've got lots of things that we need to do in lots of different ways in order not to lose many of the advantages which we have had for the last 47 years or so. This bill fits into that, but it's not the only part of it. Of course, you've mentioned the frameworks. We have a range of things within those, arrangements within those memorandum of understanding, formal and informal arrangements. And then we have the unwelcome intervention of the Internal Market paper and the problems that is going to solve and no doubt going to create, and no doubt we'll come on to those later. In terms of the continuity bill, this essentially goes back to a strategy which we developed early on in this seemingly endless process of Brexit, which was to find a way in which we could continue to have the high quality regulations that we thought were most important for Scotland, primarily in the area of the environment, but not exclusively in the area of the environment. And what we have here as a bill, of course, is in a sense a second attempt to put that into place. The first continuity bill was challenged by the UK, taken to the Supreme Court. Almost virtually all of it was found to be within the competence of the Parliament, and a very small part wasn't. But of course, the UK had changed its laws by then in what one might call a rather sneaky way in order to make the bill impossible to operate. Now, we've come back with an operable bill, a bill that has the presiding officer said is within the powers of the Parliament. And that allows us to look at and to choose those areas which we think are of most importance. Now, there's not going to be one size fits all in this. And if we lived in a very neat world, one might expect a clear and published list of criteria which would apply. But European regulation is large scale and it is very varied. So we have to approach each of the issues on its merits. And what we're trying to do is to present, and I know you've had evidence on this, a matrix of issues which would allow us to decide which of those regulations we felt were important to continue with and to keep pace with. Now, the matrix would consist of things such as the practical implications of doing so. Would it be too difficult to do so? The economic and social benefits and costs. Are those things that would be good for us, just as membership of the EU is good for us? Would taking those regulations on be good for us? The resource implications. We do not have unlimited resources, either financially or in terms of personnel. So in doing this, could we do it within our means, so to speak? Any impact on future accession, because the government has made it clear that its ambition is for Scotland to return to the EU. So are there things we should hold on to because they're going to be important to us in that process of accession? And if any of the factors mitigate against aligning, are there alternatives? Are there other things we can do? And you've mentioned the issue of frameworks. There's another way to go about this. So I think we're clear that this will require decision-making of a varied nature, depending upon the issues that we're considering, and consulting with others. And I don't think government also has all the answers. There may be things, because this is a wide-ranging landscape, which we have looked at and said we're not sure whether we should do that. Somebody else has said that's really important. And we see that in the debate as to whether there should be a duty to align or whether there shouldn't. So it's not going to be neat. It is, I hope, going to be something that we bring our intelligence and our judgment to, and at which we are also very keen, and any government should be keen to consult on and to discuss with the Parliament. And that also brings in an issue you'll also want to address later, which is the sunsetting of it. This may be something which will fall out of use because we've re-entered the EU. Actually, that's the best reason for ending the bill, because we no longer need it. But it's also something that we should look at from time to time and say, are we still using the right tools? So I'm sorry that's a slightly lengthy answer, but it's a complex area, and I wanted to lay out all the issues so that we could have a chance to discuss them.
No, I'm glad there was a lengthy answer, because there's a lot in there. And one of the things you mentioned about is Parliament's role in this. As those decisions are made, where is Parliament's role in scrutinising those decisions, those complex decisions, those decisions as well about common frameworks? Where do committees in Parliament sit there?
Well, as you know, we are bringing frameworks to the Parliament as they come to their final stage, so that they can be consulted on, so that they can be looked at closely. And we want to finish that task. I mean, one of the threats to that task lies in the UK government's internal market white paper. But as long as that threat is withdrawn, and I hope it will be withdrawn, then we will be able to complete the framework process. And in so doing, the Parliament will have a very clear role. In this area, the Parliament will have a role beginning, middle, and end. The role at the beginning, quite clearly, is the consultation that we would have with Parliament and with others about any decision we make that we would like to keep pace with powers. The middle process is the legislative process, a secondary process, and again, we'll, I'm sure, have a debate as to what that process should look like, whether it should be negative or affirmative or even super affirmative. And that is a debate you have we all have about every single bill, and no doubt we'll have it again here. And then, of course, Section 7 of the bill allows for a reporting process. So we are able to report on what we have done. I've, as you know, been taking on the reporting process for the Coronavirus Acts, and I think I've learned quite a lot, and I'm grateful to my officials for learning a lot too about the reporting process and what we should bring to the Parliament, how we should bring it, and what we should expect in terms of feedback. So Parliament will be central to this. Clearly, there are functions for each part of a democracy. Government has some functions, Parliament has other functions, but I think the interface here is quite clear. And I'm also open to looking at whether, for example, we need to publish more on this so that there is an even bigger sense of ownership from
my next question, I'll bring in the Cabinet Secretary for Environment Climate Change as well, but it is a question for both of you. The potential, Mr. Russell flagged up the potential for the proposed UK internal market to have an impact with regards to the Scottish Parliament's ability to legislate on high environmental standards. And of course, a very live issue, particularly this week, with some of the comments that are out there around animal welfare and food standards. But what do you see the potential being there for this internal market bill to effectively cut off any kind of Scottish Parliament on Scottish government?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to address that, and then for perhaps more widely, and then for Rosanna to follow through on the environmental side. It's a very serious threat. We have been working in good faith with the UK government on the issue of frameworks, and indeed, out of the whole sorry Brexit process, perhaps this is the one thing in which we've been able to, working as equals, and that's been very important on that, with the other parts of these islands, come to some conclusions on. And the process, there are, I think, 7 ready to be decided on, one of which does not relate to Scotland. The rest will come in over the next few months and into next year. I have made a commitment that we will not do anything with that process that would damage relationships. And then suddenly, virtually out of nowhere, comes this internal market white paper, which takes 2 European concepts, misunderstands them, perhaps deliberately misunderstands them, and creates a set of circumstances in which Scottish regulation in virtually every area, not just in environment, in every area, would be undermined. Because that wouldn't matter what regulations we passed or decided to pass, they could be undercut by decisions of the UK Parliament, probably operating without Scottish input, probably operating under English votes for English. So it's difficult to underestimate the damage that the internal market paper would do to the frameworks process, and we could not accept the internal market proposals. And we've made that absolutely clear. The Parliament has made it clear, as it did by voting 2 weeks ago, 92 to 31, that it was against it. If you look at this absurdly short consultation period, just a month, less than a month, dictated by the UK government, a very substantial opinion in Scotland from a very wide range of organisations saying they just did not wish this to happen, they did not think it was appropriate, and suggesting that the frameworks process be concluded. So the internal market paper forms a significant threat to all of the things that the Scottish Parliament is talking about, and it undermines and indeed destroys the ability of the Scottish Parliament to make choices for the people of Scotland in the devolved areas of competence. It is as serious as that, and certainly we could not accept it and will not accept it.
From an environmental point of view, Rosanna Cunningham, I don't know if you wish to address the same question.
I'm not sure that I've got very much to add to what Mike has already said. I mean, the problem with the level of the conversation around the internal market is that it rather indicates an intention or a desire to completely override those pesky devolved administrations who might be coming to quite rightly different views on certain things. The internal market idea, this notion that there is this internal market that can override everything is clearly designed to bring into line the devolved administrations acting perfectly properly within their competencies, and it looks as if it's just a way of coming at the devolved competencies by slightly other means, and you know it creates also creates for us uncertainty, because you know we could go through all our perfectly proper processes, including all the parliamentary scrutiny in the world here, and discover that it doesn't amount to a hill of beans as far as the as Westminster is concerned, and is overridden completely, and that is the real concern about this, and I think that right across the environmental scene, but not just the environment. I mean, this impacts is likely to impact quite strongly on our friends more widely in the rural economy, particularly. You've already flagged the issue of animal welfare and health standards, the kinds of things that are presumed by us to be decisions that we can make, because that is what it says in the Scotland Act. We can make those decisions. The whole internal market debate is about effectively being able to set those decisions aside.
Thank you. I'm going to let my colleague Finlay Carson come in now. Finlay.
Thank you, convener. We've heard a lot about the issues with the internal market white paper. Unfortunately, we haven't heard very much about the huge positives of smooth, no barriers internal market and how important that is to the rural economy and thousands of businesses across Scotland. It's unfortunate we just seem to hear about the division that it's creating rather than benefiting from how we can use the size of the United Kingdom for everyone to move forward and improve their environmental strategies and so on. My question is, Mike, I'm very pleased, I'm excited to hear that there has been a positive progress made with the common frameworks. Can you tell me how hopeful you are that these common frameworks will be concluded by December 2020, which I think was the expected conclusion date, and what role will we have in the Scottish Parliament to scrutinise those? And also, can you tell me whether when this bill is going to come forward, whether there's any potential restrictions on environmental strategy, the environmental bill coming forward, and so on, that this bill might constrain or restrict the ability to set policies within those bills that are coming up later.
I'm not sure I understand the second question, and maybe that is for Rosanna Cunningham if she understands it. But as far as the first question is concerned, I'm absolutely committed to freedom of trade within these islands. Unfortunately, that cannot be assisted by and won't be assisted by the Internal Market White Paper. What the Internal Market White Paper will do is to create new difficulties and new barriers and to impoverish Scottish business, particularly smaller business. And I was impressed, for example, by the National Farmers Union for Scotland, who made it very, very clear that they did not think that this bill, the Internal Market Bill, was required, and commended the frameworks to the Parliament. Scottish Council of Development and Industry took the same view. So, the view that is being taken by Mr. Carson of the White Paper is a very rose-tinted one, and it's not shared by those who he would normally agree with. And of course, he's entitled to his opinion. But I cannot find within that White Paper anything that says there is a threat to the existing single market, the internal market. What I can find is a lot of assertion and a lot of false assertion, for example, about the operation of the European market. This is not the same thing, and it's not being operated in the same way. In terms of how the frameworks will complete, I think you have had information that the first group of those will be completed by the end of the year. Work continues on the others. It's been delayed by the COVID pandemic, but that should not concern people because I've made a clear and binding commitment that we will operate as if those frameworks are in place, as a result of which there would be no insecurity created by them not being finished. Indeed, if they are not proceeded with, it will be because the UK government has killed them. And it has killed them because of the Internal Market White Paper, because they cannot work in operation with the regulations and the law anticipated within the internal market. That would simply be an impossibility. It would be foolishness to spend all that time and effort and to be completely overwritten on every occasion by decisions made elsewhere. So I think this is a clear choice, and I've made this clear to Michael Gove. I wrote to Michael Gove earlier this week on the matter, and indeed there is a JMC being held on Thursday, and I shall make the point again. The ball is in their court. If they wish us to work with them to finish the frameworks, very happy to do so, and that will provide what they are looking for, what I am looking for, what Mr. Carson is looking for in terms of security. Although the insecurity will continue through the Brexit process, which, of course, we don't even know what the arrangements will be by the end of the year because that is being so badly handled and is such a misbegotten adventure in any case. But if the UK continues with the single market, internal market proposals, then the frameworks essentially will be dead.
I think that I would. Sorry, I thought you were going to bring me in on that.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, I was just going to add that obviously in the session following this, we will be discussing at the committee a very particular common framework around ETS. The need for that to be in place by the end of December is really important. But there is, a question mark over whether it will be, and indeed there is a plan for an alternative way to manage the situation if it is not, and that alternative way to manage it is not something that we would agree with. And obviously we'll have a longer conversation about that in the second part of this morning's proceedings. I think Finlay Carson was asking very generally at the end of his question about common frameworks, about this particular bill and what is legislated for here. I mean, effectively what we're doing here is enabling us to align to high standards. That's what this is all about, is giving us the competence that we have within the devolved competency around environment to choose to align to high standards. Our concern about the internal market is that it might enable the United Kingdom government to stop us doing that. On the final point, which I think was intended to cover a much wider environmental picture, and I don't know whether or not you want to go on to that at this point or come back to it, but obviously, as I've indicated, the power to align will be an important part of fulfilling our commitment to maintaining and enhancing environmental standards, and to, where possible, and there's been a discussion about that, keep aligned with developing EU standards. And the objective in the bill has, in general terms, been to address any gaps and risks to standards that are created by EU exit. But we've also got a strategy document that was published earlier this year that will give us guidance in terms of the future. And that strategy looks beyond purely environmental goals. It sets out ambitions to increase the contribution of nature to the well-being of people in Scotland and to the strength of our economy. And we're developing a monitoring framework for that at the moment, which will provide a means of measuring progress towards its long-term goals. And that strategy, alongside the proposals that are in this particular bill, we think will provide a very robust framework for environmental policy out with the EU. It will ensure that we can keep our standards high and comparable with the EU. And I should flag at this point, although it's not really kind of within the portfolio, there's work continuing in the Human Rights Task Force on the proposed right to a healthy environment. So there's quite a lot of things going on beyond simply the part of this bill that we are discussing today. And I think that was what Finlay Carson was perhaps referring to in the wider part of his final phrases in his question.
Thank you. Mark, you wanted to come in on this and then move on to talking about environmental principles, but you come in.
I wanted to pick up on a point you made actually about concerns around environmental standards, but also food standards, and in relation to animals as well, animal welfare. I'm wondering if there are other examples that Cabinet Secretaries have where there are concerns, and it's been raised in the committee by Professor Campbell-Gemmell about divergent water quality standards, and I'm wondering if that is a concern, and is there a wider concern about the ownership of water and whether that could be challenged under single market proposals?
There is, I mean, in terms of the environmental issues, I must leave that to Rosanna, but just in general terms, I should point out that the way that the Internal Market White Paper is drafted and the intentions of the Internal Market White Paper really would affect all areas of devolved competence. And they would include, for example, water privatisation, health service, procurement. And interestingly, Martin Callanan, Lord Callanan, responding to a question in the House of Lords just after the Internal Market White Paper was published, drew attention to the role of the courts in enforcing these matters. So I think that's opened up the distinct possibility that, for example, the Scottish Government could say that they were against certain types of contracts in the public sector, NHS procurement, for example, and a company coming in from elsewhere, possibly as a result of a bad trade deal, because the Internal Market White Paper has also been driven by the UK's desperation for trade deals at any price. And part of a bad trade deal, say with America, an American private health company could come in and say, no, sorry, regulations in England allow us to do this. We're now insisting on doing it in Scotland. And my reading of the Internal Market White Paper is that that would mean that they could do so. And I think that is a serious step right across government. It is really difficult to envisage any area where there wouldn't be an impact. I mean, extraordinarily, the Internal Market White Paper mentions building standards. Now, building standards have been different in Scotland and England since time immemorial. There's a different climate, there's different materials, and the idea that these should suddenly be drawn into some consideration when there has been no difficulty with them long before devolution, long before membership of the EU, does give you a hint to what is going on. And it is partly the most elaborate power grab and most desperate power grab, and partly it is there because anything must be subordinated, anything and everything must be subordinated to the bad trade deals that the UK needs to do.
I wouldn't want to add anything particularly to that. I think the potential for problems arising out of this is widespread across many portfolios beyond just my own. I mean, the neighbouring portfolio, if you like, rural economy and transport, is one that would be very heavily impacted potentially. There's other impacts in other portfolios, and I think people need to understand that the concept of this internal market runs entirely counter to the ability of devolved administrations to do what they are legally obliged and entitled to do. We have now an entirely contradictory approach to it, and that approach can be applied in almost any area at all. You know, the threat to, for example, Scottish Water might be one thing. You know, there are many other areas I would question in an internal market. Is absolutely everything going to be done by English law, by the English legal system? Is the Scots legal system going to be cut right out of this? These are the kinds of things which, once you pursue that notion, will snowball, and we will find that across an enormous area of policy in the Scottish government and in the devolved settlement is effectively being set at naught. I liken this to the notion that, you know, people say, well, what is the problem? Well, you know, if you've got a happy marriage, there's no problem. But that doesn't mean to say you want to remove the right to divorce from everybody on that basis, because there are some real issues that arise and are likely to arise in many, many areas, and this will be a huge problem for us in the future. Make no doubt about it.
Okay, thanks. Can I move on now to thanks? Can I move on now to some of the detail within the bill, and in particular the environmental principles? We have received in the committee a lot of support for the inclusion of the integration principle, and also for the principle of achieving a high level of environmental protection. So Professor Scotford, for example, said that omitting a high level of environmental protection would be a glaring oversight in the bill. I wonder if you've got any further reflections on the evidence that's come to the committee and the impact of including or excluding these or indeed other principles.
I'll presume that's a question for me. On the question of calls for an integration principle, I do agree that the integration of environmental policy into other policy areas is critical. Other policies have important contributions, however, to make to protecting and enhancing the environment and to achieving net zero economy. And we see that throughout what we do in government. Obviously, a kind of a natural environment which is healthy contributes to a lot of individual well-being and to the health of communities and economy. My view is that the proposals do achieve integration through the framing of the duty to have regard, which applies to ministers developing policies, including proposals for legislation across all areas of government. The duty isn't limited to policy making in the environmental field. It applies right across the whole of government. Similarly, the duty will apply to other public authorities in the consideration of policies and programmes that will have a significant effect on the environment, not just those policies that have specific environmental goals themselves. In respect of the principle of high environmental protection, I kind of would have to note that the duty is given context by section 13. The section sets out that the duty is applied with a view to protection and improvement of the environment and contribution to sustainable development. And we can all agree with that goal. But the one thing that being a Cabinet Secretary has taught me is that when you're pursuing that goal, it has to involve a wide range of actions, resources and delivery partners. So I'm not sure that legislating for it, this high-level policy goal as a principle, would be very meaningful. It would be good if it were as straightforward as that, but the reality is actually putting that into practice requires more than simply the statement of a principle.
isn't it the point though that we've already put it into practice because we already have that commitment to EU environmental principles and we just want to retain it for the future? So why doesn't it work now?
Well, that's what this bill does. It is taking the principles that we operate under in terms of the EU and replicating them into our legislation. Trying to put some kind of higher overarching one over that, which feels like what's intended here, doesn't, in my view, improve anything, because we're taking the 4 principles that we are wanting to replicate and doing, therefore, for Scottish devolved competence what the EU does overall.
Mark, have you finished your line of questioning?
I think the point I'm trying to make, convener, is that this already is in EU legislation, a commitment to high-level environmental protection. I'm trying to understand why you wouldn't want to retain that going forward. I get the principles that are in the bill. I'm not entirely getting why you'd want to drop this one.
It's not dropping anything. This is a ridiculous question. We're not dropping anything. The point is the principles that are in this bill are what will deliver that. The kind of high level principle that you're talking about is what government is doing day and daily, and the 4 principles that we are legislating for, the ones that the EU operates by, are the ones that will deliver that.
Can I bring in Claudia Beamish?
Very much, convener, and good morning to both cabinet secretaries. Could I just pursue that with yourself, please, Rosanna, a little further, in relation to what the Faculty of Advocates had highlighted in relation to the principles, and they had highlighted the principle which is enshrined in an EU treaty on the functioning of the EU on environmental equity. And just in view of how important that is, they've highlighted the redistributive sense, if I can say that word. And while I understand, of course, what you're saying about they are high-level principles, I would have a concern if this high-level principle was missed. And you will recall, as will Mike, that both myself and Mark were very positive about the 4 environmental EU principles in the previous conference. Although that seems a very... So I wonder if you could comment on that at all about environmental equity.
Well, I'm not really very sure that I have much to add. We needed to do this year. There is no reason why, and I think I've flagged this before, other principles, and I know that beyond the 4, there are at least another 3 or 4, I think, in terms of potential additional principles. They can be looked at and added. Right now, this bill, this piece of legislation, is about closing the gap. And I think people are losing sight of that in all of this. Now, in terms of other additional principles, we got no clear consensus out of the addition of individual principles that would be in addition to the 4 that everybody understands at the moment. And that is why we've stuck pretty firmly to the 4 that we have. We need to close this gap. There is nothing to prevent us in the future from adding principles, and I would imagine that that is something that will be an ongoing discussion. But not every bill can do everything. And I think, in terms of what this bill is trying to do, it is trying to ensure that at the end of December, when the transition period is over, we are in a place as near as possible to where we have been within the EU.
Right. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I suppose just to comment back on that too, that is really the reason why I was highlighting what the Faculty of Advocates had said, that this is a high-level environmental principle, and how important the human health aspect is, in relation to that. But for the moment, Could I now move on with the agreement of the convener to discuss the issue around the duty to either have regard to these principles or to act in accordance with them, which we received quite a lot of evidence in committee on, as both of you will be aware. And I wonder whether, firstly, yourself, Rosanna, and Mike, if appropriate, would like to comment on the concerns that have been highlighted that it's not robust enough, which was highlighted by Scottish Environment Link and a number of other individuals as well. If you'd like to, if we could open up that discussion, that would be our next line of discussion. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry?
I said we'll come to Miss Cunningham first. On you go, Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, obviously, I'm well aware of the debate around this. It goes back to the consultation last year on these principles. These principles are guides to decision making, but there are other statutory duties, and we need to ensure that the duty doesn't conflict with other statutory duties. Ministers and public authorities have got a really wide range of statutory duties and other relevant considerations to consider in any decision-making process. And that's important because if a minister or indeed a public authority is alleged to have failed in a statutory duty, failed in regard to the guiding principles, that is to say they failed to have the guiding principles in view, then they are open to legal challenge. The stronger formulation of the duty, however, could constrain ministers' ability to take into account other legitimate considerations when developing policy. And the same concern would obviously apply to public authorities. It's possible that if you make this duty even tighter, it could lead to some perverse effects or hold up decision making, and that's one of those things that we try to avoid. I think there's also, other issues around defining what the duties are in comparison. So we use the word duty, but in some areas it will mean something slightly different. So policy interventions that are aimed at, for example, preventative action or rectifying pollution at source, do have resource consequences in terms of money, in terms of the land use and other resources, and in terms of the carbon emissions caused by the intervention. So it's important that while environmental principles are taken into account in decision making, we can't specify it so as to absolutely dominate all other duties and objectives. So have regard strikes the balance appropriately.
Can I just come back on that, Cabinet Secretary, because I find it puzzling. I respect, of course, the issue around resources, and you've made that point. But in terms of conflict, I find it hard to understand how there could really be conflict with those guiding principles which have been enshrined and which we've followed throughout the time that we've been part of the EU. And I find it hard to see how they could be in conflict with other. If they were robust, it would be a way of protecting our environment in the EU way. So I find it hard to understand that, actually.
Well, I mean, I would use an example from my own ministerial experience when we were putting through the Flood Risk Management Act back in 2009, which, as I recall, Mike Russell, as the then Environment Minister, started off, and I, as the committee convener at the time, translated into becoming Environment Minister to have to take it through stage 2 and stage 3, which was an interesting experience. But one of the distinct discussions that we had at the time was about the potential competing interests of 2 EU directives. One which was the Flood Risk Management Directive, which was, of course, what we were putting into legislation, and the other was the Water Quality Directive, which also emanated from the EU, and which there was expressed concern about the almost competing interest of the two potentially. And there was a very vigorous discussion around that. How did we make both the Water Quality Directive and the Flood Risk Management Directive in practice work together? And that's the kind of thing that, for example, a very specific level, I would say is the kind of discussion that has to happen. And then there has to be a kind of decision made about how to manage those competing interests. That's the kind of thing that happens in real life. And if you make a particular duty gazump everything else, then you will run into difficulties if you cannot make that balancing decision which is required.
Well, I agree to differ with you, but then I'm not a lawyer and I haven't been in government, so there we are. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I wonder if Mike has any other comment to make on this aspect of it, the duty issue.
No, I think that Rosanna has put it very well indeed, and the issue of everything having to fit together. In every piece of legislation I've been engaged with over the years, and there seem to have been rather a lot of them, unfortunately, in all of them, balances had to be struck between the new legislation, existing legislation, and the priorities. And in every committee, I've had to say, there have been people who say, "Are you taking this serious enough? Should you not make it, a demand rather, or a duty rather than simply having regard to?" And you have to recognise how the bits fit together. I don't think there is the slightest weakening of commitment to the principles, but I think making sure that they are part of the matrix of legislation rather than sticking out and perhaps being difficult to manage within those circumstances is the right thing to do. And I think Rosanna has expressed it well. I don't know if we have to agree to differ, but I suspect we probably find ourselves on the same side of saying this is really important. And I don't think it's being diminished in any way by the language that's being used.
Right, thank you both for those comments, and we'll reflect on them in committee. Thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. The principles and the having regard, does that apply in the same way that you have only asked public authorities to take the principles into account when they do the strategic environment assessment process, rather than all layers of decision making, like planning decisions, budgetary considerations? Does what you've said apply to the reasoning there?
Convener, I lost the sound at the first part of your question, so could you repeat that for me, please?
Yeah, so you just explained why they've got to have regard to instead of the duty, and you give an explanation as to why. Does that apply also as the reasoning behind why public authorities only have to apply the principles in a strategic environmental assessment rather than all decision making, for example, budgetary decisions, planning decisions? Is it the same reason there?
Perhaps. I wouldn't obviously want to make it just quite as specific as that. I used very specific examples in the previous question. The current direct effect of the EU environmental principles is on policy making within the EU. Now, go back to what the purpose of this bill is. It is to close the gap that will arise otherwise at the end of December when we come out of transition. So within the EU, laws are made that reflect the environmental principles, and these laws then drive the design of regulatory schemes. And some directives and regulations had a more direct copying of the principles into the provisions and then obviously into Scottish regulations. But I don't think, and I think I would be right in saying this, I don't think the EU principles at that level had any direct effect on individual regulatory decisions in Scotland. The principles guide the policy making, and then out of the policy you design the regulatory system that has to apply. So I'm trying to preserve the effect of the environmental principles, and I've applied, therefore, the duty to the level of policy making. So I've gone beyond the UK Environment Bill provisions in this, because they only apply to ministers, by choosing to apply the duty to strategic decisions by all public authorities. And that was in response to the consultation exercise and, the feeling that these principles ought to apply much more broadly than just to ministers. If we were to try and apply them, I think, to individual decision making, for example, individual grant funding and individual regulatory decisions, I think it would become wholly impractical and disproportionate. The principles are strategic by definition, by the way they're framed, by the way they are written. They're strategic in scope. Trying to apply those strategic level principles to frankly what would become individual sites or license applications or grant funds or whatever would be difficult. It would create a lot of uncertainty and inconsistency in decision making. It would probably make decision making, a very, very lengthy process. Everything would take a lot longer. There would be information required of applicants and processing efforts of regulators, wholly disproportionate perhaps to the any possible gain that we had out of an individual decision. However, the way that we have been doing it, the way the EU has been doing it, the way we have operated, means that if making the principles effectively guide the policy design will ensure that the regulatory schemes will reflect those principles in their application, and that's why we've chosen to do it that way. And it does kind of circle back to what are we trying to do in this bill? What we're trying to do in this bill is prevent the disruption of our systems at the end of December 2020, if when the transition period is over. That's what this bill is about.
Okay, we have some final questions around the principles. First Mark and then on to Finlay Carson before we move on to talking about the Environmental Standards Scotland. Come to Mark first.
Yeah, thanks, convener. So can I just ask you, Cabinet Secretaries, about the rationale for exclusions to Section 10, particularly around finance and budget? I mean, it strikes me that there may be some things in the budget which are not part of plans or programmes and therefore won't be included in this kind of assessment. The Climate Challenge Fund, for example. And it's also been in evidence that budgets are increasingly becoming preventative. They're increasingly looking at the causes of problems, and therefore there could be benefits, budgets being captured by the provisions in this bill. What are your responses to those?
Well, I think the intention of the provision here is basically to remove the purely financial and budgetary processes from the scope of the duty. Otherwise, the whole process would become extremely complex, and it's basically reflective of the Environmental Assessment Scotland Act 2005 provisions. The intent of the exclusion is going to be explained in guidance, again in a similar manner to that 2005 legislation. So I don't actually think that these exclusions are going to have any impact on the achievement of environmental objectives. A lot of significant environmental policies will have some financial consequences, and the intention isn't to exclude policies on that basis, in the same way that policies are not exempt from the requirements of that earlier piece of legislation. So I think perhaps this is a kind of a debate arising really out of perhaps not a clarity around what people understand at Section 10.3.
Can I come to Finlay Carson on the guidance? Finlay, you had a question on the guidance.
Yeah, thank you, convener. Just a very brief question. You've already touched on how new policies, whatever, can be developed after this is in place. But can I ask what options there are for actually increasing the scope of organisations that should be involved in developing the guidance in relation to these principles?
Well, the principles at the provisions at the moment require us to consult other persons as they consider appropriate, and we are intending to consult very broadly indeed on the guidance before laying it before Parliament. So that will be done as widely as possible, and if there are particular individuals or organisations or whatever that the committee strongly feels should be consulted, that they think might be overlooked, then we would be happy to hear from the committee.
Right, colleagues, I'm going to move on to talk about Environmental Standards Scotland. We probably received most evidence around this. Can I kick questions off with Liz Smith, please?
Thank you. My question is very much to Rosanna Cunningham on this level. As you know, the vast majority of witnesses were very comfortable with the idea of Environmental Standards Scotland, but there's quite a range of views about just how robust it can be unless its roles and the functions can be clarified. Do you accept that criticism, and how might you be able to clarify its rules?
Well, I'm not sure I do, and I go back to the risk of sounding very boring, that what we are trying to do here, forced on us out of necessity, is to, as far as is reasonably possible, replicate the current enforcement system that applies via Brussels. And I know that there is a kind of vigorous debate out there, as there has been for a very long time, around what could be put in place. My intent here in this piece of legislation is to ensure that there is something in place as of the 1st of January that will allow us to do what has been done as in as expansive a way as possible, has been done already in terms of oversight in terms of Brussels. A lot of the proposals that I see, discussions that I am aware of, are about some much more expanded ideal version, effectively down the line, if you like. And I rather kind of feel that there's really two discussions. There's does this do as much as is humanly possible? Does this do what is already being done? And then the second part of that conversation seems to be about, if we had a blank sheet of paper in an ideal world, what would all of this look like? And in a sense, those are two slightly different discussions. And I am sure that whatever this committee becomes in the next Parliament and the next Parliament will, want to come back to some of that into that longer term. These proposals, this bill, is about the very short term. This is about getting us over the transition exit into the new world that we're in, with a system which, as much as we can feasibly do, mirrors what we currently have. That was what the intent was.
Okay, and I accept that, and I think that's quite an interesting perspective, but nonetheless there is obviously a long-term view about this, and groups like the World Wildlife Fund, the RSPB, the National Trust, I think, was one other one, are flagging up that they have concerns that this new body might be a bit too close to government, and they point to some aspects of Schedule 1, Section 1, where they think there's a bit of contradiction there. Do you think it's too close to government?
Well, that at the end of the day, I suppose obviously there's a view going to be taken. It's difficult in our system to see how it could be constructed. We've chosen a form of body that the Parliament has been comfortable about choosing previously. So, for example, the Fiscal Commission. So we've chosen a way of doing this that distances us, insofar as is humanly possible, from the workings of the body. We have to create it, we have to set it up, Ultimately, there will be some accountability along the line. But insofar as is reasonable and possible, then I think that what we've chosen, the model we've chosen, is one that has proven to work already in respect of some other things that we've done, and that in that sense gives us the confidence that yes, it is. I mean, believe you me, I have absolutely no interest whatsoever in getting involved in the kind of decision making that this body would have to be involved in. I cannot imagine at any government level anybody would.
Okay, just to pursue that, convener, my last question is about what relationship you feel that the body would have with other jurisdictions in the UK and other commissions, whatever bodies they choose to set up. I mean, how do you foresee that working?
I think that there will. This is a body about what is within the power of the Parliament in Scotland, and it will have oversight over that. It will not effectively have oversight over what is not devolved. It will, nevertheless, if there are decisions taken that are about devolved matters, and if those decisions are taken elsewhere, it will be able to follow that through. There will be times, I would imagine, when it will, and I would expect there to be between the different bodies that are set up within the UK. I know the Welsh, I think, are in the process of thinking about of setting something up as well, and the OEP, as well as ESS when it's set up. Then they will have very strong working relationships, just in the way that, SEPA and the Environment Protection Agency in England do already. That's fairly standard. So they'll develop strong working relationships. What we don't want is one body sitting over them all. That's what we don't want to see. But in terms of their relationships, we would want to basically leave it to the body itself to make that decision at how much and how far it wanted to set up working arrangements. My feeling is it will be in their mutual interest to do that, but it will be a matter for the bodies themselves to choose how they will then carry that out.
Can I bring in Finn Carson, who has some specific questions around this?
Thank you, convener. My question is around the definition of environment within the bill. We've had S&H highlight concerns that the definition of environment omits habitats and species, and it does bring some concerns that the ESS will not be able to ensure compliance with the Birds Habitat Directives and associated domestic regulations. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell me whether this has been an oversight or whether there's another method to ensure that the Birds and Habitat Directive is actually abided by and complied with?
Well, in general terms, we are trying to use within the bill language which is understandable, and people, and ultimately, potentially, more importantly, courts know straight away that is what it applies. Now, what we don't want people to do is look at the definition of the environment in the bill and then just read it in isolation. And I think there's a danger that that's what's actually happening here, because it's part of a much wider set of definitions which include environmental law, environmental protection and environmental harm. When you read them all together, they are comprehensive. And in my view, it is clear that the work of ESS will include consideration of how successful environmental law is in protecting our species and habitats.
I'm sure you'll agree that it is quite concerning that SNH actually raises this as a concern. So can you give us some comfort that there will be better guidance or information to ensure that it's quite clear that the bill as it stands will ensure compliance with birds and habitat? Because this is not just someone off the street. It's actually an organisation that you would expect to understand exactly what you've just explained. So are you comfortable that the bill actually will do that and that message can get out there?
Well, indeed, and that does mean that by answering your question in the way I have, I'm putting on the record that it does do that, that it does encompass the protection of species and habitat. We can provide a fuller explanation to SNH, and you know, I'm kind of grateful to what we should probably stop calling SNH and now call Nature Scott, are looking very seriously at these provisions, and I'm happy to provide that comfort on the record here and in any other way I can, because it is absolutely our intention that that is what is covered by this legislation.
Mark has a quick question around the definition.
Yeah, so this was in relation to the environmental law definition that's in the bill. It does omit the phrase disclosure of or access to information, which of course is very relevant to our commitment to the Aarhus Convention. Could you explain that, Cabinet Secretary? Is that intentional? Is that covered elsewhere within the kind of suite of definitions that you just explained, or why is it not on the face of the bill?
So actually, I'm not sure which definition is the one that's considered relevant here. There is, you know, regulations in 2004 around environmental information, and you know, we weren't sure that it seemed very practical to just lift the definition of environmental information in its entirety and apply it to this purpose. But I will ask officials to have a look at the definitions in those regulations and compare it with a set of definitions in the bill, and come back to the committee or with a more detailed view on that, if that would make the member content.
Yes.
Thank you. Questions from Angus MacDonald.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just following up on that point from Mark Ruskell, we know that the definition of environmental law in section 39(1) of the bill, it doesn't include parts 1 to 3 of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009, which therefore excludes climate change targets from the remit of the ESS. So, given that the Committee on Climate Change is advisory rather than regulatory, do you not think, Cabinet Secretary, that climate change should explicitly be part of the ESS remit and reflected in the definition of environmental law?
Well, our decision wasn't based entirely or solely on the Committee for Climate Change advice, although obviously that is a relevant consideration. There are other things that we have to take into consideration, including the very particular relationship between Scottish Government and Parliament in setting and monitoring climate change targets, and the nature of strategic emissions target setting across the whole economy. I'm not sure that there is any need for an additional institutional voice in that process, nor that it is going to be effective or even proportionate for the new body to have to gain expertise in this area of policy. Now, the exclusion wouldn't apply to the regulation of individual measures in environmental law in pursuit of emissions reduction targets. So, for example, peatland restoration or woodland creation are the kinds of things that we would expect ESS to look at. So I think that perhaps there's not as much of a gap there as people might imagine.
Okay, thank you. Another point I'd like to explore, there have been concerns raised that there would be a governance gap when Scottish ministers exercising executively devolved powers and UK ministers exercising powers in devolved competence wouldn't be covered by either the Office of Environmental Protection or the ESS. So can I ask what your view is on that gap and how could that be resolved?
Well, I think some of my comments earlier began to kind of stray into this particular area. This committee of all committees knows that the boundaries between reserved and devolved responsibilities can be extremely complex, not least in instances of executive devolution. We are, and I've said this repeatedly this morning, this bill can only provide for matters within the competence of the Parliament. I'm clear that it would be inappropriate for Scottish ministers to be under the oversight of a UK governance body. That would cut right across the lines of devolved competence and our accountability to this Parliament. But I think it's clear that where the Scottish ministers consent to actions or regulations by UK ministers in areas within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, these matters nevertheless remain within the scope of ESS in terms of their governance role. The function of ESS is to monitor the effectiveness of environmental law, which is within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, and how it's implemented. So it can take steps to secure improvements to the effectiveness of that law, including through an improvement report. Now, there might be a need for some additional measures to clarify responsibilities and ensure that there are no governance gaps once the UK and Scottish government systems are in place. But I do think we need the frameworks to be in place before we can actually take these measures. And we've had a lengthy discussion already this morning about how likely that is in terms of timescale. So the management of this is going to be complex and will require, if we go back to one of the previous questions, I think, an equal and honest discussion amongst the various governance bodies within the UK.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Angus. And now to questions from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I think Liz Smith covered some of it, but there are one or two bits I still want to perhaps go to. In particular, just the whole issue of independence and how this compares with other bodies that need to be independent of government, particularly in relation to the powers that ministers have to change the functions and control budget and, of course, appointments, but perhaps most fundamentally the functions part. Is that a proportionate way to deal with things? How do we ensure that the ESS remains independent?
Well, somebody has to decide about what money it gets to run its operations. So, I mean, ultimately, there's no way around some of that, I think, in truth. What we're trying to do with this, however, is to provide that while it's performing its functions, it is not subject to the direction or control of any member of the Scottish Government. I referred, I think, in previous comments to the Fiscal Commission and I think also Revenue Scotland has some of that as well. So, you know, that is for us to be able to provide in as best a way possible that independence. There is a standard provision in, in it about being subject to any contrary provision in this or any other enactment, but that's just a standard thing that goes into a lot of legislation. We want to ensure that the accounts of the new body are subject to appropriate directions from the Scottish ministers, and that's because they've got to conform to the Scottish Public Finance Manual, etc. And these are absolutely technicalities with which I am, obviously aware, but would not want to be intimately involved in any way, shape or form. But that is all about setting up a body that does function properly and effectively, and has that more general, if you like, accountability. Appointing members, I would point out that the powers of Scottish ministers in respect of that are themselves to be subject to parliamentary approval, and that's contained within the bill. So changing functions and changing membership isn't just ministers, it's also Parliament, and that way it retains its independence from government. So all of that is a kind of mix of a way of trying to ensure that insofar as is possible, it stays independent. We've presented a model effectively that does provide for a high degree of independence, and the body's constraints are more about confirmation by the Parliament, and indeed the subjection of its strategy to the Parliament as well.
Finally, perhaps you referred to other pieces of legislation that touch on this, other bodies that ministers interact with. Are there any that you particularly want to draw to our attention that relate to that? Or would you like to write to us and let us know of some of them?
I think I've referred to one or two. There's a fairly standard provision within the legislation. If the committee really wishes to see a more detailed list, then we can certainly write and set out that detail for the committee. But I guess what I need to say about that is that the provision doesn't really confer a power on ministers to direct or control ESS in itself, but it acknowledges that other legislative provision, which also will have been subject to parliamentary oversight, may do so. So, accounts have to be audited. So, there are all sorts of other things that require, and Parliament would require them to be done. So we can certainly set out that longer list. But my understanding really is that that will be a set of fairly standard provisions that are included in quite a lot of different pieces of legislation for a very good reason. Mostly, I think this is about accounts, about making sure that the money is being dealt with properly.
Thank you. Claudia Beamish.
I'd just explore with you, please, the issue around the interim appointments, the appointments to the interim body, and will there be involvement Parliament in these? And do you have any concerns that, in terms of there being people in place already, that could in any way affect who actually were on the body, which when hopefully it comes to fruition as a full body? Thank you.
Well, what we intend to do is to seek parliamentary approval for appointments to the shadow body through a motion. So that's how we intend to do it. And I'm going to ask my officials to consider with the clerks, your clerks, the best options for the involvement of the committee prior to this motion. So we will come to the committee in respect of that. In terms of the shadow body then looking like it's simply going to roll over into the longer term body, I mean that's a decision that will be made at the time in terms of individual appointments. There may be people who don't necessarily want to stay on for that longer body. There might be others who do. There will be all sorts of considerations would require to be given. Some people will not necessarily want to put their names forward until they see what the body will look like in terms of work, etc. and I can't really second guess all of that. I can't really do that. All I can say is that the intention is that committee and Parliament is involved in that process.
Interim body, that's very, very useful information. Thank you on behalf of the committee. In terms, again, of just to push this a little further, in terms of the final body, is my understanding right that that will be an open appointment system? I appreciate what you're saying about the issue of people may or may not wish to stand or whatever, but that will be an open, fresh start. And if people wish to apply who are already on the interim body, they would then apply. Is that how that process would work?
That certainly would be my understanding. You'll appreciate after my decision that it may not be me that makes decisions, but it's certainly my understanding that you reopen the process, and then those people who wish to apply, and I would anticipate that some, if not all, of those who are on the existing body will want to apply, but I can't say for sure whether that is the case.
All right, thank you very much.
I'm very conscious of go back to my colleagues about the complying with international obligations and any kind of movement in terms of environmental obligations that come from the EU. Is it ESS that is going to have that role in effectively monitoring what's going on with regard to environmental law internationally and the EU, or is that going to be the individual bodies like Nature Scot, like SEPA? What's your view there?
Convener, your early part of the question cut out. Which Cabinet Secretary are you directing the question to?
I'm directing it to yourself, Ms Cunningham. So it's about keeping track on international obligations and the direction of travel with the EU. Is it ESS that is going to be tasked with that, or is that going to be down to sort of individual bodies like SEPA?
I think my colleague Mike Russell probably wants to come in on this, but my understanding is that it's the government as a whole that will monitor developments in EU law. We're not anticipating that the ESS has to do that. That would put a burden on the ESS, which would find it difficult to routinely do that. People will know with their experience with the development of EU law that can be a fairly time-consuming and lengthy process. It will obviously be able to consider examples of EU law and look at implementation in other member states, informing a judgment about how effective Scottish environmental law is, and I would anticipate that that's what they will be interested in doing. In terms of the more general question, it's the government as a whole that will monitor developments in EU law, and I would anticipate that, for example, Nature Scot and SEPA, etc., would probably be fairly relieved not to have that specific burden put on them, because apart from anything else, you would have replicated right across a set of institutions a burden which would be difficult for them to manage, and would effectively mean that a lot of different groups were doing exactly the same thing. So, as I said, in the more general sense of how we're going to do this, it is possible that my colleague Mike Russell might have some comments here.
Thank you, Convener. I would just make 2 points. One, remember what this is about. This is about continuity. So obviously it's government policy that counts within here, and the policy of the government would be to keep pace in those circumstances which they thought that was reasonable and in Scotland's interest to do so. And I laid out at the very beginning the criteria I thought the government would bring to it. However, I don't expect that this would be a matter which was without suggestions from others, if I may put it that way. There will be a range of third sector bodies and others who will want keeping pace with a variety of European regulation. So whilst the responsibility will lie with government and should lie with government, because this is about continuity of policy and continuity of regulation, there will be plenty of scope for input from others. and I'm sure there will be input from others, including the new body.
Thank you. We're going to move on to questions around individual cases and the role of the ESS in that, and Liz Smith.
Yes, I think, can we just go back, if it's all right, to this question about the responsibility that the Scottish Government body, ESS, would have in relation to oversight and obviously having to engage with other commissions across the UK when it comes to specific cases of the environment policy that obviously have a reserved basis to them. I think several witnesses at committee said quite rightly that the environment doesn't respect geographical boundaries. I'm still not entirely clear about the relationship that ESS would have to these very specific cases where there was a reserved issue. Could you say a bit more about that, Ms. Cunningham?
Well, the issue of, we're back to the issue of reserved versus devolved. If the UK government or whatever, kind of, in my view, enacts something which is properly the competence of the Scottish Parliament, then they are doing something within the devolved competence of the Scottish Parliament, and therefore that brings them into the scope of the ESS. But that's only within that context. It doesn't, the ESS can't follow them across the border and have a view about that same activity south of the border, because that would be properly them carrying out their reserved function. It's if they carry out a function in Scotland that is effectively a devolved function, then I believe ESS has the duty to include that in their consideration. So I don't know if that's really what we're trying to get at.
I'm just trying to drill down on the fact that when it came to an issue about reserve policy, where obviously all parts of the UK want to do their best by that policy making, and therefore cooperation and engagement is absolutely vital. It's just the process by which that happens that I'm interested in. I'm quite clear about the duties that the Scottish Government would have for devolved policy. I'm less sure just how the cooperation would happen. That's really what I'm interested in.
That's back to where all the joint working will be involved, the conversations, including sometimes the common frameworks. I would just remind Liz Smith that the vast majority of environmental law is actually devolved. So in these areas, there really shouldn't be very much of this. And it's not the UK ministers that the ESS can follow, but it's that decision is something that can be brought out by ESS. So how does that accord with what is the devolved competence and responsibility of the Scottish Parliament? Otherwise, that has to be looked at. Otherwise, we've got because the only alternative to that would be the OEP coming into Scotland to look at something that was actually within the devolved competence of the Scottish Parliament, but because the devolved competence had been overrun or overwritten by Westminster. So I'm just, that's why we need the common frameworks, but it's also why we need the different bodies, the ESS, the OEP, and the Welsh body, to be actually working together, setting out their working arrangements and how they will manage these particular occasional, and I would anticipate it would only be occasional, at least I hope it would only be occasional, times when there might be a slightly tricky interplay, let's put it that way. But for the ES, the vast majority of what they're going to do will entirely be about devolved competence as directed by government and parliament and all the rest of it, and they will look at whether or not things are happening the way they should be.
I think the Cabinet Secretary is right to say that. Obviously, the vast majority.
Can I bring in Mike Russell, because he wanted to come in the back of that? Can I allow him to come in? Thanks.
I didn't want to interrupt Liz Smith, but I just wanted to add a point about the template for making decisions and resolving difficulties. The intergovernmental review is at the heart of this. And if there was a working dispute resolution procedure within the IGR, at the very least, one would expect other bodies to take a lesson from that and to be able to operate it. There is no such dispute resolution procedure in place, and I'm not holding my breath for them to be one very soon. So I would want to see the intergovernmental review coming to a conclusion with a means by which people can operate. Now, the successful template for that we thought might be in the frameworks, because the frameworks have up until now, over the last almost 3 years, been voluntarily negotiated and have within them a variety of different dispute resolution procedures. But if the frameworks are to be assassinated essentially by the UK government as a result of the internal market, that rather puts us back to square one.
Liz, do you have a further question?
Well, I don't accept that last point, as you would expect, but nonetheless, I think the Cabinet Secretary is absolutely correct. In fact, both Cabinet Secretaries are absolutely right to say that the vast majority of this policy making is a devolved area, and that's very clear, I think. There are issues on the environment that reserve very important ones, and I'm just anxious that because they're so important that we have clarity on just how policy making would engage with these new setups. That's all I'm asking, and I think that's what a lot of witnesses were asking too. Thank you.
Okay. Can I hand over to Angus MacDonald?
Thanks, Convener. With regards to the Court's Cabinet Secretary, I'd be interested to hear your view on whether, if an ordinary court is to be the mechanism for appeals against a compliance notice, a sheriff court is the appropriate level, or would you be of the view that a specialist forum should be used, such as the Land Court, which would have more knowledge and expertise? Not that that's a leading.
I'm sorry, slightly taken aback by that. I mean, that's not, that's kind of not a level that's within the confines of what we're proposing here. We're not proposing to interfere at that level with what is the current process. That would a different matter to consider. And you would have to be very careful about doing that. But given that the continuity bill is about fixing a problem that we are imminently facing in terms of Brexit, at that level of decision around what court might be involved in is not one that I think. Need to be a big concern here. We're replicating what we currently do. Decisions about what might and might not happen in the future will be for later down the line.
Okay, that's fair comment, Convener. Thank you.
Just before we end this session, I mean, Michael Russell just mentioned there about the internal market bill and its potential effect on common frameworks. So obviously the common frameworks are something that comes up in this committee an awful lot and has done for the last, 4 years now, and the progress of them. And bodies are wanting to see these common frameworks ironed out and sorted out. What effect is it? Michael Russell says, you used the word assassinate. I think earlier on you said would kill the common frameworks. What effect could that have in the Brexit process?
Well, on the Brexit process, I have to say, Convener, who knows? Who knows what the Brexit process is or where it will end up? I mean, as far as we know presently, it's heading nowhere. It's heading either for a no deal or the worst of low deals, because that's, in the end, all that the UK is asking for. In terms of the relationships between the various parts of these islands, I mean, I think one could only say they've gone from bad to worse. And the internal market paper is a totally unnecessary intervention. The frameworks were always designed, and they arose out of the first withdrawal bill. We should remember that. This is, unfortunately, Byzantine in its complexity now. But they arose out of the first withdrawal bill, and they were agreed as a means by which we would be able to manage the shared competence. And this is, the shared competencies are this mythical list of powers that are coming back to the Scottish Parliament. It's not, it's misinformation. There are areas of shared competence. How do you manage those in the absence of one part of that shared competence? And the frameworks were the way to resolve it. And we went from 150 something identified by the UK, of course, not entirely agreed, down to a much smaller list which required something to be done. But that something ranges from full legislation, as in parts of agriculture and fisheries, right down to just a general ability to work together, not even a formal memorandum of understanding. How then you formalise that became the question, and a painstaking amount of work was put into place. And eventually, last year, 2 years ago, we agreed a set of principles on which those were based, and that was full respect for devolution and devolved settlement. And then painstakingly, our officials have been building these, working with outside bodies as well, consulting as required, and these will form a new network of voluntary arrangements. Now, these are voluntary, and indeed, this is well known to the UK government, because Michael Gove, in his present position, signs off every 3 months the work that has been done in a report that says this has been done without enforcing them, which is possible under the withdrawal bill. But we've said if anything's enforced, we're not taking part. So there's something of a success. Now, we have made a commitment to these. We have said they will operate. They are designed to do exactly what the UK says its objective is within the internal market paper. And suddenly, we know there's stuff going on in the background. And then this paper appears. I mean, literally, we did not see it until it was published. I mean, hours before it was published. And it is a product of people who don't want to come to a voluntary agreement. And now we have to say, no, I'm sorry. We have the frameworks working on them. We've made guarantees about them. This is the way forward. Wales is saying that too. It would really, really, really be the best thing. The UK just decided they'd made a bit of a gaffe with the internal market paper. Promise we won't talk about it too much. And what they really need to do now is to agree the frameworks with us to get these working.
Thank you. Right. I want to thank both Cabinet Secretaries for their time this morning. We are going to have a brief suspension, probably about 5 minutes. It's been quite a lengthy session this morning, and obviously we'll be retaining one Cabinet Secretary in our next session. But thanks to Michael Russell for his time with us this morning.
Thank you.
We'll now suspend. Welcome back. We are now going to take some evidence on the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme 2020 draft, and welcome back Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform. She's joined this time by her officials Ross Loveridge, the Head of Heat Demand and Carbon Markets Unit, Consumers and Low Carbon Division, and Alice Mitchell, the Head of Carbon Markets. Welcome to you all, and thank you for continuing to join us, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, in your correspondence with us, you have made mention of your reservations around the proposed UK carbon emissions tax and the impact that that would have on emissions trading scheme. Could you bring us up to date with your discussions with the UK government on your concerns about this and whether they've been resolved? And what impact are you worried that a carbon emissions tax would have on any kind of emissions trading?
Well, emissions trading is a devolved function. What is effectively covered by the ETS is devolved. A carbon emissions tax, of course, would be Treasury-led and would be immediately removing from us any real engagement in that. What's being proposed at the moment on the face of it is a reserved carbon emissions tax as a fallback to a UK ETS in the event that an agreement isn't reached to link to the EU ETS. Committee members will know just how incredibly technical this whole area is, and so there is currently a Treasury consultation has been ongoing on a carbon emissions tax, and that finishes just at the end of September. So we are in the middle of a consultation on a carbon emissions tax, while at the same time we're having we're doing the development of an UK ETS. At the moment, I'd have to say at the level of UK government, there's been a resistance to clarifying its preference between a standalone UK ETS versus a carbon emissions tax. You know, there are two Whitehall departments involved in all of this. There's BEIS, which is responsible for the climate change policy and therefore ETS specifically, but Her Majesty's Treasury is involved constantly as well. So as recently as the 4th of August, I wrote to the Treasury repeating my very strong objection to a tax on the basis that it loses all accountability to the Scottish Parliament, and frankly that contravenes the higher level principles agreed at the Joint Ministerial Council, which Mike Russell attends and is involved in. So we've got a number of things going on here, and you know, we have spent really quite a considerable time now working on this particular proposal. And this, you know, we've spent quite a bit of the previous session talking about common frameworks. In effect, this is, you know, one of the really important ones that we have been working on for some very considerable time. And we have spent a lot of time on this. Officials have spent a vast amount of time on this, and members need to be aware that at the last minute, this could just effectively be put at naught by a decision to have the Treasury step in and impose a carbon emissions tax. All of the work that we've done, all of the negotiation that's been going backwards and forwards, all of the meetings, etc., will have been put at nothing. So effectively, we have a UK government at the moment that's running almost like a twin-track approach. So on the one hand, we've got one department processing what is key common framework, and on the other hand, we have the Treasury consulting on and proposing something that runs absolutely counter to that. Now, all I can do in that position is to, in good faith, do the job I have to do in respect of Scottish interests with the Whitehall department that is actually processing the development of this policy, knowing that running counter to it is this entirely other approach, and it's really a discourteous and absolutely invidious position within which we put. And let us not forget that this isn't just about my time, isn't just about the officials' time, it's about the amount of time the Parliament, through the committee, has spent looking at this as well. And, you know, obviously, when it comes to the Treasury and their proposals of carbon emissions tax, I'd be curious to know if the committee has had any contact from them at all. I bet not.
Yeah, so I mean, we obviously have scrutiny over ETS, but we don't have any scrutiny over any proposed carbon tax. I'm going to bring in Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to move away from matters of process, which I think we're talking about, to how the two alternatives look compared against each other. And in particular, in relation to tax, if it's a tax approach, that means there won't be carbon credits which can be traded off in our emissions trading scheme. And therefore, there is not an economic benefit to a company that is making substantial progress in reducing its carbon footprint by being able to sell off its carbon credits to others who've not been making that same progress. Isn't that a very concerning practical downside to having a tax approach to this, as distinct to having a trading approach to this?
Well, I mean, it removes flexibility. It's applying across the board a single way of managing it, when in actual fact ETS works on a much more flexible basis, and it's removing all that flexibility. And that, I think, fundamentally creates a big problem. The level of emissions reductions is less certain with the tax. It's totally dependent on the right rate being set, and so far we have no proposals yet in respect of what that would look like. The ETS with an overall emissions cap does provide certainty over emissions reductions, allows the market to discover the best way of doing that and encouraging decarbonisation, whereas a static carbon tax, as I've really kind of said, with rates set in legislation, wouldn't ensure cost-effective decarbonisation. It also wouldn't link to the EU ETS market, and that's been a big part of the discussion about the setting up of a UK ETS. So the EU ETS market, the carbon price changes daily in response to supply and demand. So the tax could lead to carbon leakage between the UK and the EU, and that would be an extremely unfortunate outcome. And as the member has indicated, participants can trade excess emissions allowance, creating a stronger financial incentive to decarbonise. So with the ETS, so there are a lot of areas where the ETS is a better, far better mechanism. It is the mechanism that that BEIS is pursuing. However, we appear to have a government pursuing two very separate lines of policy at the moment. So, I mean, basically, that's as well as the individual thing that Stuart Stevenson mentioned. I think that there are other big differences between the two processes. And at the end of the day, I can be asked in the Parliament, in the Chamber, questions about operation of an ETS. I'm not, decisions about a carbon tax taken by the Treasury will effectively remove all of that from us. And, is an example of the removal of power from the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you. And now questions from Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. I must admit, I'm a bit disappointed that given we've got 4 administrations shared policy set out in the government response on a UK ETS, that we're still talking about division and talking about grabbing powers and whatever. Can we just concentrate on the paper we've got in front of us, which I think we should celebrate as a good example of how the common frameworks might work? I would suggest that it's only good practice to ensure that if the UK ETS, for whatever reason, can't be put in place when we leave Europe, that there's something developed in parallel. And I believe, as you've said, that there's the opportunity to feed into that consultation. And quite rightly, Cabinet Secretary, you've done that. You've fed in and suggested that the carbon tax, a carbon emission tax, is not something that you would welcome. So I would rather dwell on the positives of this, that we've got a 4-nation response and potentially UK ETS. And that's where I want to focus my questions. How confident are you that the UK ETS will be able to link into the EU ETS at some point in the future? Have we got an order here that will allow that to happen seamlessly?
Well, I can well understand why the member wants to try and put a rosy glow on what is in front of him. Unfortunately, the member hasn't been the one involved in all of the attempts to negotiate sensibly through all of this. And I think that the question of linkage is absolutely on point in terms of my concern. I think a linking agreement is dependent on the outcome of negotiations between the UK and the EU, and we are not party to those negotiations. So we are outside the room when any of the conversation about that is being developed, and I would suggest in those circumstances members of the party that Finlay Carson represents might want to consider making representations to members of their own party who are in government at Westminster, if they want to have any say or want to have the slightest involvement of the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government in that. The UK and the EU's negotiating positions both suggest a willingness to link our respective ETS, and I think I'm pretty clear that's what BEIS wants to do. Unfortunately, I've also had an experience where agreed across all administrations, agreed terminology was unilaterally changed after the agreed terminology between the four administrations, and that's the kind of thing which I am afraid has bedeviled an awful lot of what we are doing. There is precedent with the EU linking to other countries with the Swiss ETS link. And that is what the UK ETS order will do. It will establish a link-ready UK ETS that can be linked as soon as an agreement is reached. But there is, in my view, a considerable concern about this kind of thing falling foul of an overwhelming ideology that appears to be developing about the end of December. I haven't received any update from the UK government about the status of its negotiations with the EU on linking our respective ETS. I have repeatedly pressed the UK government on this issue to prioritise reaching an agreement on linking, given that both sides share an apparent willingness to cooperate. And I'm only sorry that we have not got a clearer statement of that from the UK government level. The statement from the Scottish Government could not be any clearer.
So let me get this right. You played your part in putting together this order for us to have the ETS align as close as possible to the EU ETS. So that should be welcomed. And you've done, as Cabinet Secretary, you've done everything to ensure that that's going to be seamless as possible. Can I also ask if you're confident that your contribution to this order will allow this to function successfully in the absence of that link to wider carbon markets?
As successfully as it can, of course, but the wider the carbon market, the more successful any such scheme will be, and I think we can all agree on that.
Okay, thank you.
Right, I'm going to go over to Mark Ruskell. Mark?
Yeah, thanks. If I could perhaps move questions on from Constitution to the climate. What we're seeing at the moment is a really big gap between the emissions that were produced by large industrial plants last year and the proposed cap in the ETS. Big gap there. That was in place last year. The gap was evident from last year's emissions. It is going to be bigger this year because of COVID and because of a lot of the industrial decarbonisation around heat and power that's happening. That cap's going to be probably even larger going forward. So I'm struggling to see how the cap that's proposed in this ETS is really going to be driving investment decisions by these bigger operators. So are you comfortable that the current caps are going to ensure the reduction in emissions that you need to meet Scotland's 2030 and 2045 net zero targets?
As comfortable as I can be. It is the proposed 5% cap is tighter than it would have been in the EU ETS, and I need to remind everybody that it's an interim cap. I argued for that tightening of the emissions cap compared to what it would have been under the EU ETS, and I'm happy that I've at least managed to secure that over a long period. I have continued to impress the UK government on the much tighter statutory targets, the ambitious statutory targets made by Scotland, and that in those circumstances a UK ETS needed to be more ambitious. I've pressed them on a timetable to move towards a net zero cap to be set as soon as possible, after the Committee on Climate Change net zero advice that we will not get, unfortunately, until after this process has to be undergone. I did manage to secure agreement that we would commit to reviewing the cap as rapidly as possible and within 9 months of that advice being received, and implementing any changes to take effect in January 2024 at the latest. I'm sure that Mark Ruskell probably doesn't think the situation that we're in is ideal. However, where we are now is partly because of the arguments that I was making to try and tighten everything up to get us fixed to it being interim, reviewable at a very particular time, keeping it at 5%, etc. So I believe we're probably in the right place. We're coming out of a massive pandemic emergency, or at least I hope we're coming out of it. I hope we're able to effect some kind of recovery, and that had to be taken into account with.
Can I bring in Claudia Beamish?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd just like to pursue this a little bit further with you, please, Cabinet Secretary, in relation to the revised climate change plan. And do you see that this will be challenging in relation to the Scotland's UK ETS emissions caps over the period up to 2030 as well? And how will that be taken into account, rather?
Well, we will obviously have to look at it all very carefully. The UK ETS works on the basis of a UK-wide cap for a UK-wide market, and of course the UK targets are somewhat different. An emissions trading scheme, as we've already discussed, does allow the market to determine where to cost effectively reduce emissions, and emissions will reduce across the whole system in line with the cap. And we do need the bigger the trading scheme, the bigger the market, if you like, the better and more functional it is. And so we do need it to work. But it's not the only thing that we have to address industrial and power emissions. And I think, while it's incredibly important, we don't want it to be seen as if it was the only thing. So there is an incentivization of emissions reductions, for example, through reductions in the reserved climate change levy tax and things. That there are other mechanisms and other ways and other policies which will also have a bearing on this. And it's managing this is managing it as best we can for everything. And there are things that the UK government and the climate Committee on Climate Change was very clear that there are aspects of emissions reductions which really are only for the UK government to set in place. And I frequently refer to the fact that there are many reserved aspects that require to be dealt with if we are actually going to achieve emissions reductions. And I fall back on the phrase that I use, that the UK government needs the Scottish government to achieve its 2045 target if the UK is going to achieve its 2050 target, but equally we need the UK to do what it needs to do to get to its 2050 target if we're going to achieve our 2045 target. We have to work in tandem on this.
All right, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary.
Mark Ruskell wants to come back in very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, like waiting between now and 2024 to adjust the cap and get the right cap level in place, I mean, is that not just going to set us back? Is that not going to effectively just mean that the rest of us who are not covered by ETS, industrial emissions scheme, will have to work harder to reduce emissions?
Well, if Mark Ruskell can come up with a solution that involves getting the UK government to do what we want it to do and to do it now, then I'd be pleased to hear it. The reality is we are trying to do the very best we possibly can do, given what we're currently having to deal with. What we've managed to do, and with respect, the reviewing of the 5% cap within 9 months of the CCC's advice and implementing the changes to take, that was something that I had to press hard to get to. So if I hadn't been able to achieve that, we wouldn't have had anything in that regard. So I find it difficult to envisage how this would have looked if we had not been pressing the way we were pressing. And at the end of the day, this is going to be arguably at the bigger issue level. This will be a constant management of, if you like, competing ambition. And yes, there are some issues, but if we don't get the ETS up and running, frankly, the situation will be even worse.
I have one final question, Cabinet Secretary, before we move on to the next item on the agenda, and that's about something you mentioned in your letter to the committee on the 2nd of June, which was about a public-facing concordat between ministers from all 4 administrations that would accompany the framework outline agreement. Can I ask when that's going to be made available, if it's going to be shared with the committee?
The answer is yes, and I think I'm right in saying this is the framework outline agreement you're talking about. Yes. I think you may have already been sent a letter on this. It was shared. I suspect it's sitting in your inbox because something was shared yesterday in respect of this, and it has been cleared now by ministers, but it may be something the committee wants to come back to when they've actually gone and been able to actually have a look at it. I'm sorry, the timing of it just didn't work for the committee.
It's in the.
I think we've got it. It certainly left us, so you should have had it by now. And it does set out the principles for joint governance of the framework. So it's there or thereabouts, and you may wish to come back to it either in written form or not. So the full FOA. So we've got this. Perhaps I ought to be clearer. The summary note has been shared. The full FOA has got to be signed off by all ministers, but you'll get that as soon as possible. What you've got in your inbox is a summary of what's coming. That makes sense.
Right. It does. Thank you. Thank you. Right. We are now going to move to the motion. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 22351 that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2020 be approved. Cabinet Secretary.
Formally moved.
Are there any comments from members before we move on? Seeing anyone wanting to speak? Right, I'll put the question. The question is that motion S5M 22351 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be approved. Are we all agreed? If anyone is not, can they please put no in the chat box? We are agreed. So that is the motion now agreed. I want to thank the Cabinet Secretary for her time this morning and to her officials who accompanied her throughout this morning's proceedings. At our next meeting on the 8th of September, the committee will take evidence on our Green Recovery inquiry, and that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you all.